Well, good morning. I see that it's 10:30. My name is Adrian Bertrand from Six Capitals Advisory. It's my pleasure to be able to welcome you to the South Africa-UK PACT funded webinar, which forms part of our UK PACT funded webinar series. Today, we'll be looking at an introduction to climate reporting trends and frameworks. This is part of our foundation level webinar series on climate-related financial disclosures, brought to you by this particular South Africa-UK PACT funded project. Before we go into the formal introductions, just to mention a few webinar housekeeping and administration matters. There will be an opportunity for webinar participants to ask questions. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment while presenters are speaking, we ask that you do that through the chat function. If you would like to make a verbal comment, please raise your hand, and our team, assisting on the webinar administration will then enable you to speak. We'd encourage you to ask your questions in the chat function while the presenters are speaking. It allows us to keep the webinar interactive, but we will also be having a dedicated time for Q&A towards the end of the webinar. Also to mention that the webinar will be recorded, and a recording of the webinar will be available via this project team resource page, which is available on the DNA Economics website. You can see the link included on the screen there. And should you encounter any technical connectivity challenges as a result of Zoom, please would you email our colleague Safaku at apros.coza, and he'll do his best to get you back into the session. We're very grateful for your participation today, and we look forward to some good discussion. Please do keep it interactive and let us have your questions and comments. In terms of the agenda, I'll be providing a brief welcome and introductions, as well as the project overview. Unfortunately, our representative from the British High Commission can't be with us this morning, but hopefully he will rejoin us for the next webinar in the series taking place on Friday morning. I'm pleased to let you know that our colleague Seren Mardure, who's an investment analyst at WWF South Africa, will be presenting an introduction to the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD. Seren is an investment analyst at WWF South Africa. He works in the Sustainable Finance team and Business Development units at WWF South Africa. Seren has worked previously at a number of leading insurance and asset management firms in South Africa, where he's had various research, strategy, sustainable investment, and responsible investment roles. Since joining WWF in 2016, Seren has been working at integrating environmental risk management principles into investment management, whereby promoting sustainable finance and helping to develop green financial solutions. Seren currently sits on the investment committees for the Green Outcomes Fund, as well as the Sanlam Living Planet Fund, and is also part of the WWF team, which is working on the Sustainable Landscape Finance Coalition. And I'm very much looking forward to learning from Seren as he introduces the TCFD framework to us today. Joining Seren as the other presenter for today's webinar is my colleague Melanie Smith. Melanie is the practice head for research and reporting at Six Capitals Advisory. In this role, Melanie heads up our ESG research and reporting capabilities in supporting our clients, such as this UK PACT funded project, which has been undertaken in partnership with our project consortium partners. Melanie led the Six Capitals research process into the WWF and Sanlam supported research project, which took place late last year and earlier this year, into the state of TCFD reporting in South Africa. Melanie has recently completed her Master's in Sustainability at the Sustainability Institute of the University of Stellenbosch, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to Melanie's presentation on the state of global and local climate-related financial disclosure. Let me introduce myself. I'm Adrian Bertrand, also from Six Capital's ESG Advisory, working with Milani and Safaku, who's assisting behind the scenes for this webinar. And my role is supporting our ESG advisory practice area and spend time working with our clients around ESG strategies and research, whether that be listed companies or investors. I'd like to take an opportunity to introduce the UK PACT project and then to focus a little bit more on this specific project which has received UK PACT funding. So UK PACT stands for Partnering for Accelerated Climate Transitions. And this is a £60 million program which has been running since 2018 and will run into 2022. The mission and the vision of UK PACT is that it is delivered by the UK's Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and it does this through the UK's International Climate Finance Portfolio. UK PACT is there to support the achievement of nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, as well as the long-term goals of the 2015 Paris Agreement to limit dangerous climate change temperature increases. The project is demand-driven, or UK PACT as an initiative is demand-driven, adjusting its key focus areas based on partner countries' needs and specific sectoral priorities. UK PACT will achieve this by working with partner countries such as South Africa to both improve capacity building and the capability of key institutions to reduce emissions and to foster inclusive economic growth. The project also seeks to address barriers and constraints to clean and green growth, as well as to support the pursuit of opportunities for greater climate ambition. UK PACT has a number of country programs active, and these are flexible, demand-driven programs with three core components to support transformational change. UK PACT is active in a number of emerging markets such as China, Colombia, Malaysia, Mexico, and most recently South Africa. UK PACT is also supported through the Green Recovery Challenge Fund, which supports innovative capacity building projects in a wider range of overseas development agency eligible countries such as South Africa to promote emissions reductions and low carbon solutions. UK PACT also supports partner countries through skill shares and secondments, as well as through specifically funding projects such as this one in terms of capacity building in country programs. So in terms of the South Africa UK PACT country program, which was launched in July last year, it's a program of approximately £3 million in funding, which is supporting 10 projects. These projects are split into either sustainable finance, sustainable transport, or energy. And for more information on the specific South Africa UK PACT program and projects supported, we encourage you to visit the UK PACT country program South Africa website. There are a number of project resources and project information which is available to interested stakeholders. These you can access via the UK PACT websites, as well as via this project's website resource, which is available on the DNA Economics website. Introducing this specific project. This is a project that's been established to address barriers to both the analysis and reporting of climate-related financial risks and opportunities, in line with the TCFD recommendations. Our project team, which I'll explain on the next slide, combines both domestic and international best practice experience, both in terms of research and advisory work, but also in terms of modeling work. And our partners have a deep understanding of South Africa's climate change policy and ESG landscape. The objective of this project is to speed up the use of detailed, useful, and timeous climate-related disclosures to assist investment decision-making by South Africa's finance sector, specifically in this phase of the project represented by asset managers and retirement funds. This is importantly a demand-led process, as are all UK PACT funded projects, where the intent is to provide support and tools that are easy to use and widely adopted, and are demand-led in the sense that our stakeholders and project partners are advising the project team on the tools and resources which are being developed. So at its core, the project seeks to supplement and enhance the impact of related initiatives which are focusing on supporting the uptake of TCFD. Our initial project focus is specifically on transition risk as it relates to listed equities and its broader impacts on the asset management and pension fund sector in South Africa. In future phases of the project, our intention is to be able to expand the analysis to also address physical risk, so going beyond transition risk, and to also look at other types of financial institutions such as banks and insurers, as well as to expand the scope from listed equities to other asset classes, so that we can develop fully South Africa climate-centric risk scenarios across asset classes. As part of this first phase of the project, we are already starting to consider physical risk requirements and how that can be expanded in any subsequent phase of the project. In terms of our project partners for this consortium, this project is led by DNA Economics. DNA Economics is an economic and development consulting firm with its office in Pretoria, and they have a climate change practice area that's been very active in this space, certainly over the last number of years, and have advised both government and the private sector in terms of climate policy. And we're grateful that we're able to work with DNA Economics in the delivery of this project. Supporting DNA Economics as the lead project partner in this project is the Greenhouse, Vivid Economics, WWF South Africa, and Six Capitals Advisory. The Greenhouse are sustainability consultants with strong engineering background, and also have a wealth of experience domestically and in the rest of Africa in advising on these issues. Vivid Economics is our international partner who are informing our climate risk models that we're working with in terms of the toolkit that's being developed as an output for this project. WWF South Africa and Six Capitals are assisting with the capacity building, training, and stakeholder engagement side of this project. You're welcome to visit our project website for more information on the project partners. But from a governance perspective, this project has got both an advisory group as well as a steering committee. The advisory group represents a number of stakeholders from the broader South African financial sector. Our steering committee comprises Batseta, the Batseta Council for Retirement Funds in South Africa, ASISA, and the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. And we have a number of opportunities for stakeholders to engage with this project, much like this webinar series and today's webinar, which we are making available as part of our capacity building and outreach efforts for this project. And so we'd encourage you to join us for all 4 webinars in this webinar series. We also have virtual workshops being in progress, underway in September. Those workshops are focused on retirement funds and asset consultants, and we'll be having 2 full-day sessions focused on training for retirement fund representatives and asset consultants. And then we will have 4 half-day virtual workshop sessions planned for asset managers and more professional investors, where we will be looking at best practices, and it will be interactive workshops allowing for more interaction than is currently possible through more of a webinar type engagement. In terms of the project work streams and outputs, we have three broad work streams under this project: capacity building and awareness, analysis and reporting, and the development of a toolkit, as well as best practice examples. Some of the capacity building and awareness work that has already been undertaken by the project team. We have done a kind of foundational publication, which has been done under the Atleha Financial Education Publication brand. We'd encourage you to have a look at that. We've also developed short awareness articles, and of course we are running these workshops and webinars. We've done research into the state of TCFD and climate reporting, both internationally and South Africa. Those deliverables have been led by DNA Economics and Vivid Economics. Those reports are public and available via the project website hosted by DNA. And we've also looked at more than 50 JSE top 50 companies in terms of their TCFD reporting and level of disclosures. And those more than 50 fact sheets are also available on the project website. We will be really reliant on our partners and stakeholders to inform the development of the toolkit, which is a process that's underway. And we would also encourage stakeholders to get involved in terms of the workshops that will be used to facilitate what goes into that toolkit, as well as to work through a number of best practice global and domestic examples of what does TCFD compliant climate related reporting look like, and how can we learn from the early leaders. So in closing, I've mentioned a lot around project ambitions and objectives, as well as resources which are available. Please do visit the project website to access those resources. Obviously, there are a number of stakeholders, and indeed today we have a number of stakeholders represented in today's webinar. Different stakeholders have got different information needs, and so we do really request your involvement and feedback around what you need from a toolkit perspective that will assist you in having decision useful information available to you, both as a user of climate-related financial disclosures, if you happen to be an investor, but also how we can support you potentially as a corporate who is embarking on TCFD reporting to your stakeholders, such as your institutional investors, for example. With that, I'm going to invite Seren to take over and to present his introduction to the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. A reminder, please, to please ask your questions in the chat function. If you would like to make a verbal comment, please feel free to raise your hand, and we can give you the opportunity to make a verbal or an audio comment. Seren, thank you very much. I know that you've got a few polling questions as well, and we look forward to active participation in the polling as well. Thanks very much, Seren.
Thank you, Adrian, for that wonderful introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. So if I could just get confirmation from you guys that you can share my screen and hear me clearly.
We can see clearly, Seren. Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay. Sure. So I'm just going to start here. So good morning, everyone. My name is Seren Madre from WWF, as Adrian mentioned. And thank you all for attending today's session on climate risk reporting frameworks and trends in climate-related disclosures. So I'll be taking you through the next part of today's session, which is introduction to the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD as we call them, the TCFD recommendations. And with this session, we'd just like to take a view on start with taking a view on existing climate reporting frameworks, and then move into the TCFD more formally, as well as then diving deeply into the recommendations and the 4 thematic areas of TCFD and the guidance around making disclosures as it relates to those 4 core areas of TCFD. But let's start with a polling question just to get a sense of everyone in the room. So Safako, if you could please load the first polling question for the audience members. And this is about which climate-related disclosure framework are you most familiar with? Is it the CDP? Is it TCFD? Is it the Global Reporting Initiative? Or is it the Science-Based Targets Initiative? You can see some results coming through. Hopefully all of you can see it as well. TCFD seems to be leading the way with the CDP coming in second. So CDP and TCFD seem to be some of the more popular choices, as one would expect. Wow, and we've got quite a few people in the room today who are familiar with TCFD, which is great. Hopefully we can upskill you a bit more to get you more comfortable with TCFD by the end of the session. Alrighty, it looks like the responses are starting to slow down, and that's great. Thank you all for participating, those who have participated. It looks like the TCFD seems to be the most familiar framework within the audience today, 56%, followed by the CDP framework, and then the GRI and SBTIs. So thanks everyone. Safako, if you could take the poll out. Just going to clear that. All right. So thanks everyone for participating. With that, we'll jump into the first part of my session today, which is just giving you an overview of some of the existing climate reporting frameworks and standards that exist. The TCFD, as we've seen on the previous poll, is quite popular and many people are familiar with it, as well as CDP. The Global Reporting Initiative, Sustainability Accounting Standards Board has produced a framework on reporting on climate-related risk, as well as the International Integrated Reporting Council. And there's been many different organizations and frameworks that's put together. What's happening now is you're seeing these frameworks working together in terms of aligning and becoming more standardized, which the TCFD is really leading the way in helping that happen. But there are global initiatives that's bringing these different parties together to help develop the alignment and taking these things forward. I think it's important to highlight the CDP because CDP is very closely related to TCFD. Now, CDP is extremely popular and it runs a global environmental disclosure platform. Over 9,600 companies have been disclosing with CDP for a number of years now, and many South African companies do as well. And the CDP covers a number of important areas as shown here from 1 to 13 on how to assist companies to disclose information as it relates to business operations as well as climate change. So there's a strong link between CDP and TCFD. And what we've been seeing is that CDP has really been helping prepare people for TCFD recommendations. In fact, they're very aligned to one another. And as a result, we see that many people will be prepared for TCFD, but there are some challenges with CDP from investors or companies. It can be quite comprehensive. It can be quite difficult for people to find some information. It can be quite repetitive. It can be a bit overwhelming for people to digest the information that comes out. So with TCFD, we see some of those challenges being addressed, and we see a more of an alignment coming through. So CDP has been great so far. It's helped a number of investors and asset managers in disclosing their risks, understanding their risks. It's helped companies better prepare themselves for integrating climate change and climate risk within their organization. And as we move forward, we see that with TCFD becoming more popular, CDP has really been helping people take that next step up. going now on to the background of TCFD. So for this next part of the session, it's important to start with just where the TCFD is coming from. And I know many of you are familiar with this, so we don't have to spend too much time here, but it's good to know that the TCFD has come from the Global Financial Stability Board, and they've set up this task force to develop recommendations for effective climate-related disclosures, which can support financial services like investment, credit, and underwriting to better integrate climate risk within their operations. The FSB, and therefore the TCFD, is committed to market transparency as it makes markets more efficient, and the recommendations are meant to help companies in their understanding of climate-related risks, as well as support them in being transparent and disclosing them in a user-friendly way. In our first part of this webinar series, we highlighted why climate risk is important, and the FSB was obviously aware of this as well. It's climate change is a major global risk on top of mind for many business leaders and political leaders and regulators, globally speaking. So the FSB set out to, they recognize this, and they set up a task force to develop a set of recommendations for their members. So they call upon their members and their network and engage with them thoroughly to develop their set of recommendations, which is probably one of the reasons why it's so popular, is because of the deep network that the FSB has, plus the representatives at the top level, being Mark Carmody and Michael Bloomberg. So just want to touch on the momentum quickly, because TCFD has grown quite remarkably over the last few years. And my colleagues later will go deep into this, but I couldn't do the background to TCFD without touching on how quickly it's become adopted by so many stakeholders across the globe. It's taken CDP a number of years to get to the high number of users it's got today. And TCFD has been quite quick off the mark in terms of getting over 1,500 organizations globally, and the number of assets under management, as well as a number of regulators looking at implementing TCFD. So I had to touch on the momentum of this so far, but we'll get deeper into the trends of TCFD later on in the presentation. Just before we get into diving into the recommendations, I'd like to stop here to take a poll before continuing. So Safako, if you could load the second polling question, which is around if your organization has become a TCFD supporter. So has your organization become a TCFD supporter, or are you actively considering taking up the recommendations? So we see already it's quite close. So there are quite a few people who are actively taking up the recommendations, many not yet. A few not sure, and some of you have been early adopters and already a formal supporters. Okay, so thanks everyone for participating in the poll. It looks like people are actively considering taking up the recommendations, but it's quite close. I think this one is a bit more. There's a bit more of a split in the room today. So not yet between considering, and we have a few in the room today who are already formal supporters, and there are a few who are not sure as well. So thanks for that. It's good to get a sense of everyone who's in the room, and hopefully, with those who are not sure, we can help, and those who are actively considering recommendations, as we get into the recommendations and the guidance for the recommendations, it can help you and your organization take this further.
Saren, if I can interrupt you there, we have had one question raised in the chat function by Manfred, and his question relates to the cost and resources that go into reporting, especially when one compares CDP and TCFD reporting. Do you need to do both, or can you pick one? and Nicole has responded to that, and we encourage participants to please comment on questions, and we especially want to hear from those who are practically applying the TCFD and CDP frameworks. But Seren, if you'd like to venture a response to Manfred's question now or during your presentation, I'm sure that would be appreciated.
Sure, thanks, Adrian. Resourcing is always a key issue for organizations. No matter which organization you're in, you got to manage your resources effectively, and if you've got a overwhelming amount of reporting to do, it can be quite scary and can be quite difficult to realize or to decide where to allocate your team. If you're doing CDP, should you be doing TCFD? It's a question that I think each organization needs to ask themselves internally. I think CDP is widely popular. Many investment managers use that as a source of data. And I think with TCFD, it might replace CDP for many organizations if you see that there's a significant overlap. I think what I've been noticing so far is that if people respond to CDP, they can use that as a base to help them produce a TCFD report. So you could, in the starting years, maybe do both. If you can see that it doesn't take too much time to actually go from CDP to doing a TCFD report, then you should do both. And it could happen over time that TCFD becomes a reporting requirement where CDP is a voluntary disclosure. So it's up to organizations to kind of make those decisions themselves. But I certainly see the value in doing CDP and then doing your TCFD report because the information and disclosures are aligned. But you've got to decide internally how to, as your own organizations, you've got to decide internally how best to approach these things on a case-by-case basis. Yeah, so that's what my response there to Manfred would be, to consider these things carefully. And but there is a lot of overlap between. So doing both, one might make it, CDP might make it easier to do TCFD, but if you're resource constrained, then you might just pick one. And with TCFD, the trend seems to be that it's going to become a requirement. So I would, forecast that as almost becoming more important than CDP. But that's a future thing to come. So don't take my word for it. Let's just see how everything plays out. So thanks for that question. I'll move on to the next part of today's of my session, which is getting into the recommendations. So the recommendations are structured into 4 thematic areas, and these core elements of TCFD are governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. So those are the 4 pillars. And then these 4 pillars, underneath them, there's certain guidance and recommendations on how to address these issues. And the TCFD, the task force, they provide guidance for all sectors, and then they provide supplemental guidance for certain sectors. So I think many people have the question of, is TCFD relevant for me? If you're in the financial services sector, then yes, definitely, these recommendations would be relevant for you. If you're outside of the financial services sector, then these recommendations could also be relevant for you, and the guidance from TCFD kind of splits that up. And because of these 4 core areas or 4 pillars of TCFD being widely part of many organizations, it applies to both financial services organizations and those outside the financial sector. Here's an overview of the 4 pillars plus the recommended disclosures beneath those 4 pillars. And I'll be going into each of these recommended disclosures in the next section. So you don't have to worry about the slide here. It's just to highlight that beneath each pillar is a set of recommended disclosures. And beneath those recommended disclosures, the task force provides guidance on how to disclose the best climate-related information and the most relevant climate-related information. So I think before jumping in here, before jumping into the next section, there's one more poll that I'd like to ask. And Safako, if you could load the poll onto the screen, please. And this is about which of the 4 pillars of the TCFD framework is your organization least comfortable with? So we see some responses coming through. It seems the metrics and targets section seems to be leading the way. People seem to be quite comfortable with the governance side. So the metrics and targets is clearly coming up as the section in pillar in which people are least comfortable with, followed by risk management, and then the strategy section with people quite comfortable with the governance section. So thanks to everyone who's been participating. See that the poll numbers seem to be slowing down a bit. So it's clearly metrics and targets, and it seems to be the pillar which people are least comfortable with. And that's the last pillar. So I'm gonna jump into the next section, which is starting with just the overview of what the 4 pillars are. And then we'll go pillar by pillar with the recommended disclosures and the guidance on those pillars.
Saren, sorry to interrupt again.
Sure.
We've got another question, and I thought before you get going into the next section, let's just raise that if you'd like to respond. Otherwise, we also encourage representatives from companies who are reporting using CDP and TCFD to respond. But we've got a question from Shamila. She asks us, are you aware of reporters already choosing one framework over the other, for example, CDP or TCFD? She's heard anecdotally of companies choosing to drop CDP and to rather integrate similar types of CDP disclosures into what they would have done for CDP into a TCFD report. I don't know if you'd like to respond to that now or later, but we'd also encourage those reporting organizations to respond as well via the chat function. Thanks, Saren.
Thanks, Adrian, and thanks for that question, Shamila. Yeah, similar to the question that was popped in the chat earlier, I think people are going to start dropping CDP. I don't want to mention any names, but yeah, it seems that TCFD is coming in and becoming the more popular choice of framework. But that being said, CDP has led the way for many years in terms of the disclosures and information that's provided to investors and asset managers, and as a huge database for people to draw upon. And then while TCFD is very climate focused, of course, and CDP includes climate, and it includes water, and it includes a forest as well. So there's other elements to CDP that TCFD doesn't include, specifically around water and forest. But yeah, and anecdotally, people I think are starting to kind of weigh these two things up, and pick one over the other. So only time will tell if people start dropping CDP. But yeah, based on conversations, I think and that discussion is certainly happening in reporting units within different organizations. As you can imagine, the pressure for reporting units is quite intense. The JSE has quite strict reporting requirements, and investors require quite a depth of information beyond climate. So, anything that can streamline the processes should be looked at internally. But yeah, that remains to be seen. And personally, I hope that both continue to be used. As a user of CDP, I find it quite useful, and I think for what they've all done for for investors for the past number of years now. I think it'd be sad to see them fall away. But yeah, time will tell on that one. Thanks, Adrian. So I'll move on to the next part if there's no further questions there. And that is getting into the recommendations. And the first pillar is around governance, which is about disclosing the organization's governance around climate-related risks and opportunities. The second is around strategy, which is around disclosing the actual and potential impacts of climate change, risk and opportunities on the business's strategy and financial planning. Then on to risk management is about disclosing how the organization identifies, assesses and manages climate-related risks. And then on metrics and targets, it's about disclosing the metrics and targets used to manage climate-relevant risks and opportunities. So the first theme is governance, and the first part of the recommended disclosures guidance on the governance theme is about describing the board's overall climate-related, the board's oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities. So some of the things that companies should highlight around this is the board's processes, how the board reviews climate data, and how the board sets performance objectives, and of course, how the board monitors all of this. So these slides can be a bit text heavy, and I apologize for that, as it can be quite difficult, but these slides will be made available after the session, so you can go through these in detail. Or you can pop some questions in the chat if there's anything specific you'd like me to touch on, or you can reach me after this session if there's any questions that you might have that come to you. But that's the quick overview. I'll be going through these quite quickly, or at least to summarize the guidance on the relevant disclosures. So the second piece of guidance for governance relates to describing how management assesses and manages climate-related risks and opportunity. Specifically, this is about disclosing the management levels, looking at climate-related risks and opportunities, and any committees or structures and how these structures might work. And of course, how management monitors climate-related issues. So, which levels of management is involved, and the specifics around what processes work to help management monitor these things. The next pillar is around strategy, and the first recommendation around disclosing climate-related risks around strategy is about describing the climate-related risks and opportunities the organization has identified over the short, medium, and long term. So firstly, we want to get a description of what the organization considers to be the relevant timing horizons. Then secondly, you'd want a disclose a description of the specific climate-related issues for each horizon, and a description of the processes used, as well as providing a description on the different geographies and the risks and opportunities per geography. The second part of the second recommended disclosure under the strategy pillar is around describing the impact of climate-related risks and opportunities in the organization's business strategy and financial planning. So those two elements. So this is about looking at climate change and climate-related risks as it relates to the organization's product and services, or its supply chain and value chain, as well as how it affects operating costs and revenues, capital expenditures. And important in the climate change world and in the TCFD recommendations is the use of scenarios. So how would the organization's business strategy and financial planning be affected if the organization was no longer able to access capital? And this is about looking at the different scenarios and how the organization's access to capital changes in those scenarios. So here again, talking about climate change scenarios. And if you take into the third part of the recommended disclosures around the strategy pillar, is about describing the organization's resilience, taking into consideration different climate scenarios. So where they believe the strategy may be affected by the scenarios, how their strategies might address such potential risks, and the time horizons of these strategies. The next pillar is the risk management pillar. And this is around the first recommended disclosure under the risk management pillar is about describing the organization's process for identifying and assessing climate-related risks. As you can see, process is important to the TCFD, and it's important to investors, underwriters, and lenders. It's important even internally to review these things so that organizations within themselves can make sure that the risk management processes for identifying climate risks are strong, such that when you disclose these, external stakeholders, external investors or underwriters or credit providers can get a sense of how the organization determines the relative significance of climate-related risks in relation to other risks. And the definitions of the risk terminology used or reference to existing risk classification frameworks is also very important. It's important to disclose these things in the risk management process, because how one organization defines a certain risk could be slightly different from others, or what framework one organization uses could be different from another one that an organization uses. Ultimately, these things should be quite similar, but they're not always comparable on a like-for-like basis in terms of looking at companies in a certain sector or across sectors. So the second recommended disclosure under the risk management pillar is to describe the organization's process for identifying and assessing climate-related risks. So organizations should describe their processes, how they make decisions, how they mitigate risks, how they transfer, accept, or control these risks, and also describe how they prioritize these risks. In addition, people should also talk about the materiality of these climate-related risks that they identify. So, as an example, an organization could identify that the energy usage is a risk for them. But then they talk about changing their light bulbs, and as a disclosure, an investor would be saying to themselves, how material actually is that action? So this is a basic example to illustrate that in the risk management, what people really want to see is how material the materiality of these things and the processes behind how one has achieved, how has one come to those conclusions about what's material. Then the third part of the risk management pillar in terms of recommended disclosures is describing how the processes for identifying, assessing, and managing climate-related risks are integrated into the organization's overall risk management strategy. So each organization has their own risk management processes. Some may have sustainable and ethics committees. Some may have enterprise resource planning system or enterprise resource management system. And each organization approaches the management of risks in their own way. So describing how climate-related risks are integrated in that process is an important disclosure to make, especially under the risk management pillar. Lastly, moving on to the metrics and targets. So this is the pillar where I think a lot of people said that they would like or they understand the least, and understandably slow. So this pillar is about disclosing the metrics and targets used to manage relevant climate-related risks and opportunities. So the first recommended disclosure for under theme 4 is about disclosing metrics used by the organization to assess climate risk and opportunities in line with its strategy and risk management process. So organizations should disclose the key metrics they use and the key targets they have. Organizations should also consider including metrics associated with other variables like water, energy, land use, and waste management. And again, one should look at the materiality of the metrics and targets used. And I think what's interesting is to see how are these metrics and target incorporated into remuneration policies for executives or senior management. I think where people also can struggle a bit is providing metrics to allow for trend analysis. So that's important to provide historical data. And also a part of this pillar is talking about or recommending that organizations should look at setting an internal carbon price, which was a question asked in our previous webinar, which is quite interesting. And it's good to see that some organizations out there are looking at setting internal carbon prices, but there are, carbon pricing mechanisms happening in the open market that one can use as guidance. And with the carbon tax in place in South Africa, that can also serve as a bit of guidance for people who are looking to take up carbon pricing. But as my colleague Louise Nodier, who's expert on climate change, related to our session in the theme 1 of this, our session earlier in these webinar series, is that the carbon tax price might be a bit too low. So internal carbon pricing is important for organizations, especially when organizations can be located in different geographies, in different areas, and under the applicability of different carbon tax regimes. The next part of metrics and targets is about disclosing scope 1 and 2, and if appropriate, scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. I think reading many different South African companies' integrated reports, scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions seems to be one of those metrics and targets that many people are comfortable disclosing, and there's frameworks and established frameworks for measuring this, such as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And the GHG protocol is an industry accepted methodology for measuring and monitoring greenhouse gas emissions. So this is one of the areas where I think, in terms of scope 1 and scope 2, people seem to have a grasp on because of the GHG protocol, and it's been disclosed by many companies over a number of years now. Then lastly, on theme 4, metrics and targets, the recommended disclosure is to describe the targets used by the organization to manage climate-related risks and opportunities and performance against these targets. So organizations should describe their key climate-related targets, such as those related to greenhouse gas emissions or water usage or energy usage. And they should also describe any other goals that may include efficiency or financial goals, scenarios, financial loss tolerance, avoided greenhouse gas emissions, net revenue goals for products and services. In describing these targets, organizations should also consider the following: is whether the target is absolute or intensity based. So that means if you're disclosing greenhouse gas emissions, do you disclose the complete, or is your target an absolute? So how many tons of carbon are you targeting? Or is it intensity based? Intensity means you take your revenue and you divide that by greenhouse gas emissions, and then you know how much rand or dollar you earned per a ton of carbon that you produce. And if you're targeting intensity, then you can grow your organization while still growing your emissions, but the intensity would reduce. So the rate at which you grow your revenue should be at the rate, it should be higher than the rate at which intensity, which GHG absolute emissions grows. So that's what intensity is looking at. Timeframes, whether it's 1, 2, or longer term 5, or even longer term 10-year targets. We know that many organizations are targeting net zero by 2050 and to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030. So these targets and timeframes should be clearly disclosed, as well as the base year from which the progress is measured, and the key performance indicators used to assess progress against these targets. So those are the 4 themes. And before I close my session, I think there's one more poll question. So Safaku, if you could load that onto the screen, please. So just a moment while the poll would load. So there we go. In your opinion, does the responsibility for disclosing climate-related information sit primarily with companies, investors, or both? So it seems that companies and investors both seem to be leading the way, followed by companies. Yeah, so I think most people think that both should do it. There's 25%, a quarter of the audience thinks that it's just the responsibility of companies. See fewer poll responses coming through, but it seems that the majority of people in the audience today think that both companies and investors should be disclosing climate-related information. So thanks all for those who participated in the poll. I've got one last slide from my side, and then I'll hand over to Melanie. So just in conclusion, if we recognize that climate-related financial reporting is still evolving, the TCFD's recommendation provide a foundation to improve investors and others' ability to appropriately assess and price climate-related risks and opportunities. The task force recommendation, they aim to be ambitious, but also practical for near-term adoption. The task force expects to advance the quality of mainstream financial disclosures related to the potential effects of climate change in organizations today and in the future, to increase investor engagements with boards and senior management on climate-related issues. So I think that's a nice way to close off my session, and also relates back to the overall project, which is about aligning South Africa's climate-related financial disclosures with international global best practice. So with that, thank you, and I will stop sharing and hand over to Melanie. Adrian, if there's any questions, perhaps I can stop there to take them. Thanks all.
Thanks, Seren. Very much appreciate your presentation. I don't see any specific questions in the chat function, but if anybody would like to raise a question audibly, please just raise your hand, and Safaku can give you audio. Otherwise, is that a question? I'm not seeing any questions. So Melanie, thank you very much, and looking forward to your presentation on the state of global and local climate disclosures.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Melanie Smith. Thanks, Adrian, for the introductions, and Seren for the thorough overview of the TCFD framework. So yeah, now that we have a bit of a better understanding of what the objectives of the TCFD framework is and what the 4 themes are that it covers, let's take a closer look at climate reporting trends, specifically as it relates to the TCFD framework. So the latest available data, which I've looked at earlier in this month, indicates that there's now more than 2,300 organizations globally, spanning 88 countries that formally support the TCFD recommendations. The table on the left, or at least on my left-hand side, shows the annual increase in the number of organizations that have officially expressed their support for the recommendations since 2017 up until the end of the first quarter of 2021. Globally, 266 companies have registered their formal support for the recommendations in the first quarter of 2021. And formal support in this context then means that organizations have committed themselves to working towards its own implementation of the recommendations. And after relatively modest increase at the start of, or over the period of 2018 and 19, support grew exponentially in 2020. And if the first quarter of 2021 is anything to go by for support of this, the rest of 2021, we're sure to reach more than 1,000 organizations that would formally then support the TCFD recommendations. So from a global perspective, the uptake of the TCFD recommendations, I quickly just want to refer back to the report published in October last year by the FSB, which indicated progress over the last year for the TCFD report and what some of the findings and takeaways were based off of that report. So they indicated that nearly 60% of the world's largest public companies support the TCFD recommendations, and then either report in line with the recommendations or both. And then they found that disclosure for climate-related financial information has increased since 2017, but their view and that's continuing to grow, although they've expressed the need for continuous progress on that front. And we've also seen, which is, I think, great, that a lot of energy companies as well as material and building companies lead on the disclosure front from a global perspective, with 40% that's energy-related companies that disclose and 30% materials and building companies. From a resilience in terms of strategy perspective, only 1 in 15 companies that they've reviewed disclosed information around that. And I think when we get to the local front, I'll also touch on that in a bit more detail. But I think, yeah, the more, if you want to call it, quantitative side of these themes for the framework is typically where one sees kind of the biggest need for progress, where on what you want to call almost qualitative, the governance and strategy side, which companies have dealt with historically. I think from a reporting perspective, that seems to be well covered. So then they've also indicated that from an asset manager and asset owner reporting perspective to their clients and beneficiaries, there's been progress, but at this stage it's still insufficient, and they'd like to see more progress being done on that front. Then from users, they found that the impact of climate change on a company's business and strategy perspective was the most useful from a decision-making perspective. And from that perspective, in terms of users, the most useful information for decision making, which I just referred to, also paved then the way, or is useful to pave the way for preparers to step into, like, going into a roadmap, to be able to use that to work towards that. Then I'm going to skip through some of these because they've already been covered in some of the previous slides. But disclosure information has increased, but there's still some need to make progress on that front. They've seen between 2017 and 2019 that there's a 6% increase in terms of the across the 11 recommended disclosures from the framework. And then they've also found that disclosures around the framework primarily take place in sustainability reports, and on average information aligned with the recommended disclosure was over 4 times more likely to be disclosed in sustainability reports than in financial filings or annual reports. So I just want to quickly check here. yeah, I think most of the previous slide I've covered some of these points that I've made. Yeah. So let's quickly move on a bit to some of the global drivers that we've seen have accelerated the need for disclosure. So the need for disclosure has kind of been driven largely by public pressure from stakeholder side, different stakeholders, and the need for providing more decision useful information to be able to make better investment decisions. And then we've also seen globally that there's been a lot of progress on the policy front that's aimed at preparing us to move to a low carbon economy. On the regulatory front, we've seen a lot of movement by regulators and different governments globally that are increasingly under pressure to introduce the TCFD requirements as mandatory requirements for disclosure of climate-related financial risks and opportunities. And disclosure is likely to accelerate as governments start to announce that disclosure in line with the TCFD recommendations will become mandatory. And we've seen a number of countries such as New Zealand, the UK, Switzerland, and some other members of the G7 grouping indicate that they are planning to phase in the mandatory requirements of disclosing climate-related information. On the harmonization front, which we've touched on in the Theme 1 webinar slightly, we've also seen that some of the bigger standard setters towards the end of last year indicated they intend to work together to create to work towards a more global standard for reporting. So as to aim to address issues such as comparability between data sets and so forth. Yeah, so just to wrap up this slide, as TCFD aligned disclosure accelerates in different jurisdictions around the world, it's becoming clear that South African companies will also need to do the same if they wish to remain competitive in attracting international investments or satisfy international climate disclosure requirements when operating in other jurisdictions where they might also be listed or have operations. So, let me just go over some of the climate reporting trends we've been seeing in South Africa in our landscape. So despite South Africa being one of the more advanced markets in terms of integrated reporting and addressing broader ESG issues, climate-related financial disclosure is largely still in its infancy, particularly around those elements that I mentioned earlier, which relates to the more quantitative side. Although I note Seren's comment around the metrics and targets, it seems from the research we've done, there's good progress on that front. So while this is rapidly changing and the levels of disclosure are increasing fast, particularly over the last few months, there's been significant effort is still required before local climate-related disclosure will provide sufficient information for investors to make informed investment decisions. There are, however, signs that disclosure is gaining prominence locally. So climate disclosure in South Africa has typically been a prominent policy issue, and we formalized that at an international level back in 2009, when we first pledged to the international community to fight climate change. And then back in 2012, we saw developments from a national climate change response policy perspective, which was subsequently finalized in 2012, and also saw the National Development Plan include a chapter dedicated to the transition to a low carbon economy. Then more recently in 2018, a climate change bill was introduced to Parliament in 2018 to provide a solid legal basis for expanding South Africa's climate change adaptation and mitigation response. The climate change bill will provide the legislative framework for the transition to transition the current system of voluntary carbon budgets to a mandatory system and establish sectoral emission targets. And then in 2019, we saw government also introducing a carbon tax to guide a low carbon economy transition. And the first phase of that tax came into effect in June 2019. The tax by pricing carbon attempts to provide the appropriate price signal to move South Africa towards a more sustainable low carbon growth path. Then just lastly, in 2020, we saw government establishing a presidential climate change coordinating committee, and the task of that committee is to advise South Africa's climate change response and affirming its commitments to a just transition and climate resilient and low carbon economy in order to manage and mitigate the impacts of anthropogenic interferences with the climate system. In the same year, South Africa also submitted its low emissions development strategy for 2050. I must just add this, obviously, the slide is just a snapshot. There's a lot more, I think, happening, but one can have an entire webinar on that on its own. So yeah, this is just kind of highlights that we're indicating here.
Sorry to
yes,
interrupt.
Adrian.
We have a question from Lonwabo, and I think this slide will speak to part of his question, or the question. So the question was, what have been the shortfalls or limitations of TCFD, and what was or is being done to increase stakeholders' engagement locally and internationally? I think the first part of the question around shortfalls and limitations, you know, that I think we can speak to that, but certainly I think the slide that you're going to present now, just around some of the work that National Treasury is doing under their sustainable finance work streams and the TCFD working group, I think that may be helpful to Lonwabo's question. Okay,
yeah, happy to try and see how I can answer that while going through this slide and some of the subsequent slides, Adrian. Okay. So in terms of some of the different drivers that we've seen nationally and kind of actors that are advocating for increased disclosure of climate data in South Africa, one can kind of summarize it. I think one can add to this slide more broadly with a variety of other actors and regulations that we have, but I think this kind of summarizes some of the key drivers that we're seeing for us locally to kind of ramp up and work towards increasing the pace of that transition into a low carbon economy. So our 2050 South Africa's low emissions development strategy for 2050 has motivated the recommendations of the TCFD to be implemented to ensure that climate change related risks and opportunities can be understood and managed, and to ensure that finance is deployed in a climate compatible way. On the National Treasury front, in 2017, they convened a working group consisting of financial sector, regulatory agencies, and different industry associations to initiate the development of a sustainable finance framework in South Africa. There's been a lot of work behind the scenes, I think, on that front, and it forms part of the Sustainable Finance Initiative hosted by the Banking Association of South Africa under the Climate Risk Steering Group, which is chaired by National Treasury. And then in 2020, we saw the publishing of National Treasury's technical paper on financing a sustainable economy. And then more recently, in this year, National Treasury released a draft version of the National Green Finance Taxonomy, which will act as the official classification or catalogue that defines the minimum requirement for assets, projects, and sectors that are eligible to be defined as green, as in line with international best practice and national priorities. This means they then address climate change and other environmental priorities while also seeking to reduce some of the social risks and enhance social impacts. That taxonomy will then help investors, issuers, and other financial sector participants to track and better monitor and also demonstrate the credentials of their green activities in a more confident and efficient way. Then on the FSC side, we've seen in 2019 the release of their guidance note on sustainability of investments and assets in the context of a retirement funds investment policy statement, in which the FSCA clarified the responsibilities in terms of Regulation 28, which I'll also touch on now. So although boards are required to consider ESG factors, the FSC states that disclosure and reporting on sustainability issues does require refinement, especially in the context of climate-related disclosures. Then regarding the Prudential Authority, is responsible for regulating financial institutions and market infrastructures to promote and enhance safety and soundness, and then support financial stability. They are members of the International Sustainable Insurance Forum, and it's their view that climate risk reporting is a crucial element in understanding both physical as well as transition risk. And they're currently working towards developing a robust framework for the assessment and reporting of climate risk. From a SARB side, we've seen them identifying climate-related impacts as a risk to the South African financial sector around 2019, and that included its risk assessment matrix that they've released in 2020. Then just lastly on Regulation 28 as part of the Pension Fund Act. So although the regulation doesn't strictly speak to climate specific matters, it would probably see institutional clients exerting a bit more pressure to their service providers in managing climate risks, but that regulation does require pension fund trustees to explicitly consider broader ESG factors when making investment decisions. And funds are therefore required by law to consider climate-related risks when making those type of decisions, which is in the long term to ensure that members' retirement provisions are protected from impacts of poorly diversified investment portfolios. So some of these drivers here are signals that are, like I mentioned when I started the slide, are signals that government is ramping up efforts to ensure that South Africa's future alignment with international commitments are made in terms of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, as well as the Paris Agreement to be able to contribute to the global efforts around climate change. So just in terms of our private sector as well as civil society landscape, there's also a variety of drivers that we've seen kind of encouraging improved climate disclosure. And I think generally speaking, the South African landscape is broadly supportive of climate-related financial disclosure due to a combination of things like mandatory reporting of GHG emissions by some of the large emitters, as well as widespread adoption of ESG reporting frameworks that are increasingly aligned with the recommendations of the TCFD, and as well as public interest in these mandatory disclosures. And then we've seen different private and civil society sustainable finance initiatives that have kind of sprung up over the last couple of years in support of that. So I think, yeah, broadly speaking, you can probably put these private sector actors into two buckets: commercial entities that consist of your non-state controlled financial players, and then other institutions such as private entities made up of civil society organizations such as NGOs and so forth. And on that front, I think we've seen good kind of engagements with corporates, especially over the last few years, to encourage and really press on that issue that we as various stakeholders that form part of the South African financial system do need to encourage different players such as reporters, corporate reporters, and then investors to up their reporting game. We've also seen locally that we have some of the stock exchanges that have implemented different listing regulations and different mechanisms and so forth they've put in place. And they're also involved in more global initiatives relating to climate change and broader ESG themes. And from an industry perspective, there's been a good kind of engagement by different initiatives such as CRISA and the Banking Association and the Code for Environmental and Social Risks that have kind of driven the need for and seen kind of pushing reporters to really come to the party in terms of reporting. So Adrian mentioned this briefly in his introduction. We've done some work together with WWF's Sustainable Finance team towards the end of 2020 and the beginning of this year. And we undertook a project related to kind of better understand what the landscape is from an uptake point of view for the TCFD framework in South Africa by different companies and investors. And I think, yeah, what's encouraging there to see was that progress is being made. And yeah, sorry, I'm interrupting myself here. I wanted to mention that we engaged with a number of stakeholders, which was quite nice. I think you are then able to really kind of get a better sense of what's happening on the ground. So we were able to chat to reporting companies, different investors, such as asset managers, some of the retirement funds, and different industry bodies in this space. And in these engagements, several aspects of the framework were discussed to be able to get a better sense of the level of knowledge and awareness, as well as what the value was of the framework for these reporters, and the process, and how, particularly kind of how far people are in their adoption process, and then also related to some of the successes and challenges that some of these reporters were facing. So getting back to my earlier point, the research indicated that although a lot of progress has been made on the reporting front, and that's particularly been driven by working off the base of reporting standards such as the CDP, both investors and reporters, or reporters are leading the pack, but investors in particular still have a lot of work to do in trying to get to grips with some of the recommendations from the TCFD framework. And I think that kind of also echoes then back some of the findings that the 2020 report released by the FSB indicated. So yeah, I think it's especially true when it comes to, like I mentioned earlier, the more quantitative sides of calculating climate risk. That's yeah, the areas where most investors as well as reporters indicated that they're struggling with a bit more. And I think in sectors like banking and insurance, you know, the big thing people are grappling with at this stage seem to be quantifying their climate risk on portfolios and so forth. So yeah, then I'd like to just share some of the more recent work that DNA together with Vivid has done, that Adrian mentioned earlier, that we've done as part of the bigger project for UK PACT. I'll get into the details of the table here on the left-hand side, but I think we've seen a growing shift in the focus of disclosure around climate risk and opportunities, and with some moves towards trying to quantify that. And yeah, one can see we as a country is people that are playing in that space. There's an increasing understanding of climate risk, although there's clearly still some work to be done. The framework has also assisted both investors and companies to be able to better identify their gaps and understand and analyze their climate risk, which was one of the things that we got from some of this research that we've done, as well as the prior research earlier and towards the end of last year. In our engagements with some of these stakeholders, local asset managers have also found engaging with their investee companies around the topics or the themes that the TCFD framework has suggested, does help them to better understand their risk and influence companies in adopting the framework themselves. Then we've also seen increasing internal stakeholder buy-in, and that's played itself out through developing more companies developing dedicated TCFD reports, which has helped highlighted the benefits of using the TCFD framework. On the last point, I think we've also seen better disclosure in terms of the data, and it's helped us to increasingly be able to compare some of the data sets, although I do acknowledge the fact that we still have, particularly within different industries and sectors, there's still a lot of work to be done around that. So just to quickly touch on the table in this slide. So this summarizes some of the work that we've done earlier in the year. And we can see that supporters in South Africa typically sit within your formal pockets, so that those that have signed up and agreed to be formal supporters of the TCFD, and as well as your more informal supporters. So that's companies that have not fully aligned but are starting to disclose, probably by using some of the work they've done around CDP reporting. So, and I have checked the TCFD's website. That number, I think, has slightly increased. I think at the beginning of this year, we had 15 formal supporters. It's increased to 18. I think Momentum came up, and then Perpetua and another organization. So I think we're standing at 18 is the real, like, fresh number. So also just to link back to some of the work we've done as part of this project, we, together with WWF, looked at some of the top 50 JSE listed companies and how they're faring in terms of climate disclosures. So that analysis just confirmed that climate related disclosure is probably more widespread than we initially thought. Yeah, like I've mentioned, and Sarah's also mentioned, that has a lot to do with organizations that have historically used CDP as a base from which to report. And I think that then makes for a more easier transition to address some of the TCFD frameworks recommendations, which is great, because that means that it affirms that although companies think it, I mean, it does require resources from organizations to be able to report on these frameworks, but I mean, a lot of the groundwork has already been done, which makes the transition a lot easier. So yeah, then just lastly, this was the list of companies that we looked at earlier in this year. Like I mentioned, this is now slightly changed with 3 additional organizations that have signed up. And I think what is great to see is that there's quite a bit of financial sector players, as well as minings and minerals industry players that have signed up, which is probably not unsurprising on the mining and minerals front, given that, you know, climate as part of the environmental component, which they would have historically reported on, is something that they've well covered historically, I think. So then just to touch on some of the barriers that we've been able to get from our discussions and engagements with different stakeholders on this front is, like one of our participants mentioned earlier towards the session, resources has always been an issue when it comes to reporting, particularly to smaller organizations. But I think what's great to hear from our engagements with some of our stakeholders that we've spoken to throughout these research processes was that from a TCFD reporting perspective, although, you know, one's resources are, particularly I think over the last year, have shrunk, the kind of encouraging words that we got from either reporters or investors were that you know, they would prefer companies to just start the process, that journey of their TCFD reporting, because it is a journey in itself. And I mean, one would all like to see people or organizations cover all of the pillars and 11 recommendations in full, but I think the reality is that it's better to start with something than completely avoiding starting that process. Yeah, then in terms of the other barriers, we saw just a general lack of understanding of the significance of climate related risks and opportunities. Boards and senior management are only now starting to understand that climate related impacts may have material impacts on profitability, and as a result sufficient resources have not historically been allocated towards doing the detailed analysis that's required to underpin financial disclosure. And so I mentioned this briefly earlier around standardizing reporting. So while we've seen different initiatives that support the reporting around GHG emissions, which has largely been standardized across different sectors and industries, this is yet to be the case for climate-related financial disclosures. Not only do metrics used to report differ, but the assumptions underlying some of the methodologies used to generate the metrics, such as the scenarios and timeframes, are often unclear and not comparable. And I think that links to probably a broader discussion nationally as to how we head, where we're heading in terms of our national contributions. And yeah, I think in some areas there's still a bit of unfamiliarity with the recommendations. Some of the local institutions have only recently become aware of some of the recommendations and are still trying to kind of find their feet and better understand the extent to which these recommendations would then apply to their organizations. And then the data gaps, that's something that I've addressed. I'm not going to cover that in too much detail. The other point that some of these reporters and companies that are venturing into reporting in alignment with the TCFD was there are concerns around reporting in line with the TCFD recommendations as a result of fear of being scrutinized and not having made, or being perceived as not having to have made a greater effort to be able to provide high quality data, which yeah, that then leads to kind of them being compared with different peers in the industry, and questions being asked around why certain organizations are able to report on certain aspects and some not. A thing that was an issue that was commonly mentioned by some of the stakeholders were the reporting fatigue. Many people that or individuals that operate in this space and work within particularly the reporting sector of organizations, they mentioned that it can become quite taxing to be able to address all of the different requirements of various standards and frameworks, and the lack of resources then also adds to that. Some have indicated that due or as a result of this, sometimes that entire reporting exercise then just becomes a bit of a tick box exercise, which then obviously risks companies to not effectively communicate their mitigation efforts and not providing investors with a useful picture of climate-related risks and opportunities that they face. So I've mentioned, briefly mentioned the lack of resources that can relate to financial resources or different skill sets within different departments, or just the time to be able to fully align to the disclosures with the recommendations. Then just the last two relates to a mismatch between planning horizons and expected risk. The risk linked to climate change, particularly those linked to physical impacts, are expected to materialize far outside of the 3 to 5 year planning horizon that most organizations use, and preparing for risks that only materialize in a few years. Although I think it's fair to say that we're already seeing some of those playing out currently in different areas globally. But that makes it a very difficult task, given that the remuneration is often linked to performance over much shorter time span, and incentives for longer term planning are often lacking. Then the last one, which we also did a poll on, there's always the matter around accountability. Climate disclosure is voluntary at this stage for particularly in South Africa, but I think largely around the world, although we're seeing that transition now happening to mandatory requirements. So with the additional focus from international and domestic institutional investors, such as the retirement funds, along with other stakeholders, we'll likely see an increase call for accountability, and the recent engagements with different companies have kind of raised that question around who's responsible for kind of shouldering a lot of the work around disclosure. Is it companies? Do investors need to drive that agenda? And that's also been from a civil society perspective, a question that's been I think raised raised at AGMs to call for growing, to call for accountability. So before I end of this session, I think this is probably a good opportunity to just again reflect on some of the why, which Louise touched on in theme 1, around why it's so important for stakeholders such as civil society actors and others, that we so desperately need improved disclosure. And why does disclosure matter to a number of stakeholders, which we covered in theme 1, but particularly for men and women and different members of marginalized and vulnerable groups and communities, which Louise spoke about the equity kind of side of things on Monday's session. So like Louise rightly mentioned, climate risk disproportionately affects the poor, as they will feel the immediate effects of climate change first. And in addressing the identified barriers that we now know, play a role in limiting climate-related information, the disclosure around climate-related information, it could aid in achieving a more equitable and just and sustainable transition to a low-carbon economy. So this may be addressed through, for example, aligning GESI considerations in ESG reporting as a means to promoting climate-related financial disclosure best practice. Just one example. So in closing, I think that's a kind of thing that we just need to keep in mind when speaking about climate-related disclosure and why it's important. So in closing, the barriers that are currently holding back widespread disclosure of climate-related information, although they are real, I think it's clear from some of the research that it's by no means insurmountable. And given the vulnerability of South Africa to both physical and transition risks, and a local landscape that is broadly supportive of climate-related disclosure, and a growing familiarity with the recommendations, there's little reason to doubt that local institutions can emulate their performance with respect to global leadership with integrated reporting of ESG factors, and not only aligned with international related climate-related financial disclosure best practices, but hopefully to surpass that one day. And yeah, that wraps up the trends section on our end. I see there has been a number of comments and questions. Adrian, just quickly tell me, would you like to run the polls first before we get into the questions?
Hi, Mel. Thank you very much for your presentation. Yes, I think there was a bit of chat. One of the questions from Nicole was, do we want to take a risk and suggest when we think mandatory TCFD reporting might come into play? It would be great to hear from any experts on the webinar, particularly from National Treasury or the regulators, if they'd like to give some guidance. I don't know if we want to give an exact date in mind, but definitely, it is likely, looking at international developments in that regard. And then I've also taken the liberty of sharing a few links to resources that have been mentioned during your presentation. So this is an opportunity for our participants to ask any further questions or to make any comments. But while we wait for those, can I suggest that we do load the final few polling questions, Safaku, please? So the first question is, in your opinion, do you think climate-related financial disclosures in South Africa are currently at an adequate level? Yes, or yes, but still needs more attention? No, or not sure? Hopefully you will have a better sense of that as a result of today's webinar. So it looks like quite a number of participants today feel that there's insufficient climate-related financial disclosures at present, and that it does need more attention, and others are still unsure. I think that is to be expected. So thank you very much for participating in that audience poll. Let's move on to the next one. I've gone and closed my poll there, so I can't read it. But this picks up on Melani's comment around gender and social inclusion. Often those that are most marginalized in society bear the brunt of physical climate risk. And so we've got two questions that are focusing on gender and social inclusion. So the first poll there is, do you feel gender and social inclusion concerns are being considered in the context of climate-related financial disclosures in South Africa? Yes, no, or not sure? Okay. And UK PACT as a funder to this project has a strong focus on gender and social inclusion as part of the scope of this project. Yes, Melanie?
Apologies. Now, I just wanted to add, it seems some people are still voting, but I think the overall view is that no, it's not being considered currently.
Thanks, Melanie. You're quite right. Almost 2/3 feel that it's not receiving enough coverage under the scope of climate-related financial disclosures. Thank you for that, Melanie. Could we have the final Jay-Z question, please? So the question is, what priority gender equity and social inclusion issues and concerns would you like to see or feel should be featured in analysis and reporting toolkit, which this project is developing? Gender equality, equity, social inclusion, or perhaps you're not sure? And again, this highlights the importance of the just transition as we move to a low carbon economy, and to make sure that we transition equitably for all partners and stakeholders. So again, 65% voting in favor of social inclusion, and the balance between equity not being sure, and a few on gender equality. Thank you very much for your participation in the poll. I just want to quickly share my screen just so that you've got the resources that are available. So I'm not seeing any further questions. So then it's an opportunity for me to wrap up. Thank you again for joining us for this webinar under the second theme of the 4 webinar themes that are being offered. You will have seen in the chat function, we have just uploaded a post-webinar feedback form via SurveyMonkey. Please can we ask that you complete that survey? It shouldn't take more than 5 minutes to complete. If you could start doing that now. That's a requirement in terms of our funders for presenting these free webinars. And we would love to have your feedback and constructive views on how you've benefited from attending this webinar. And if there are any other themes that you'd like us to include, or you've got any questions, please do let us know, and we'd really appreciate your feedback, positive or negative. Also, just to mention, if you're a retirement fund trustee or a principal officer, you can qualify for CPD hours for attending today's webinar. Please would you get in touch with us if you'd like to take up that opportunity. Also to mention that we've got the second of these Theme 2 webinars taking place on Friday. If you found today's webinar useful, please do join us, or encourage your colleagues to join us for Friday's webinar. There are still spaces available. And then next week, we'll be going into the next theme, which will be looking at governing and managing climate risk. And we've got 2 webinars on that theme taking place on either the 23rd or the 25th of August. Please do join us during either one of those webinar sessions. And then on the 26th of August, we'll be offering the first of the themes under theme 4, which will be determining the impacts of climate risk. So I'm not sure if there are any further questions that have come up in the chat function. I'm not seeing any further questions coming through in the chat function. So let me thank our presenters, Seren Marjore from WWF South Africa, Melanie Smith from 6 Capitals Advisory. Thank you very much to both of you for very good presentations, very comprehensive. Please do keep in touch. Please do raise awareness around our forthcoming webinars, and we look forward to hosting you at the next webinar session. With that, please do spend 5 minutes to respond to the post feedback survey. We'd appreciate that, and you can get in touch with Safaku, who you should have his email address if you'd like to make use of the CPD benefit through Batseta. Thanks very much, everybody, for joining us, and wishing you a good day further. Take care.